know Mr. Rush isn't here. So.
Let's call this hearing meeting to order. And I will recognize myself 5 minutes when I find it. It's hidden in the back. Recognize myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Welcome to our hearing this morning as we examine the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's fiscal year 2019 budget proposal. The NRC's essential role in licensing and regulating nuclear facilities is of great importance to my Illinois constituents. Illinois produces the largest share of nuclear-generated electricity in the country. Throughout the state, the commercial nuclear energy industry supports thousands of high-paying jobs, funds local school districts, and provides reliable, clean, base-load electricity around the clock. In fact, a little over 75 years ago, Illinois was a site at a lab under the University of Chicago's football field where physicists and engineers first generated a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. We are proud to be the birthplace of nuclear technology. While I do not have any commercial nuclear power plants in my Southern Illinois district, I do represent the nation's only uranium conversion facility located in Metropolis, Illinois. In October, the plant's owner announced it was suspending operations at the site due to market conditions for uranium. We have a glut of uranium on the market and lingering low demand, in part due to the suspension of the Japanese fleet of nuclear power plants in the wake of the Fukushima earthquake or tsunami 7 years ago. While there may not be an immediate fix to the uranium market, the most important policy to help my constituents return to work is a strong, positive outlook for our nation's domestic nuclear industry. To maintain a robust nuclear industry, Congress must consider the many different opportunities to provide a pathway to keep existing plants operational while establishing the foundation for new nuclear energy deployment in the next decade. While mining, converting, enriching, and manufacturing nuclear fuel is a necessity to support the front end of the fuel cycle, we are long past due to manage the back end of the fuel cycle. As we do this, we have to recognize the uncertainty about our used fuel commitments will continue to be a political albatross around nuclear energy development until the Department of Energy starts sending clear signals and reconstitutes its nuclear waste management organization. I very much appreciate that last year, the Commission, for the first time since 2010, requested funding to resume its review of the pending Yucca Mountain license application, as required by law. While it is still incumbent on Congress to provide the funding, it is refreshing to see an administration that is committed to following the law. As I've noted on many occasions, the NRC's independent review of the license will answer the safety and environmental impact questions the state of Nevada has raised. To gain the public's confidence in nuclear energy, we must have a functioning nuclear waste management program. The Commission's strong legacy of effective and efficient regulation is another key component of public confidence. However, the many pressures on the nuclear industry provide an opportunity for the NRC to reassess its regulatory process and flexibility. The Commission's fiscal year 2019 budget sets the parameters for how the organization will steward its resources in a changing environment. Last month, we heard a clear message of urgency as your former colleague, Bill Ostendorf, succinctly pointed out. Our civilian nuclear energy industry infrastructure is the underpinning of our strategic nuclear defense capabilities. In fact, I went down and visited with Admiral Caldwell just last week, and it was a great visit, and I would encourage a lot of my colleagues to do that. In turn, an agile regulatory regime that oversees the breadth of the nuclear supply capacity supports our national interests. Mr. Ostendorf's testimony highlighted the critical need to advance a suite of nuclear policies, define our nuclear future, and establish a durable program to sustain the industry from the next generation of nuclear leaders. This morning, we will seek some of those answers, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address this critical issue. And with that, I have a minute remaining. Does anyone seek time? The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Tennessee for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My home state of Tennessee, TVA is leading the way with 3 nuclear plants and 7 units capable of generating an average of 7,800 megawatts of electricity each day. Watts Bar, and I know you all are familiar with Watts Bar, that's near the northern end of Chickamauga Reservoir in East Tennessee, is the first new nuclear reactor built in the 21st century and supplies enough electricity for about 1.2 million households in the Tennessee Valley. Watts Bar experienced its fair share of challenges and setbacks in the process to becoming operational. Unfortunately, we're seeing those challenges across the country, and without a reasonable, modern, flexible regulatory system, the U.S. will continue to struggle to maintain existing plants, leaving little opportunity for new plants to come online. So it is essential that the NRC develop a more agile and responsive regulatory model equipped for today's changing energy industry and security needs. And I yield back.
Generally yields back to time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning. Thank you to both Chair Shimkus and Chair Upton for holding this hearing. And welcome back, and thank you to our chairs, Nicki and Commissioner Burns, for appearing before the subcommittees today. And let me extend a special welcome back to Commissioner Barron, who served with distinction as a professional staff member of this committee for a great number of years. So welcome to all of you. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's mission is to license and regulate the nation's civilian use of radioactive materials to ensure adequate protection of public health and safety, to promote the common defense and security, and to protect the environment. This, indeed, is no easy task, and I want to put an additional emphasis on protecting health and safety. Members on this committee have a range of views on existing and new nuclear power, but I believe there is unanimous agreement that we need high standards for nuclear safety. So thank you to the Commission staff that have this awesome responsibility. We're here today to discuss the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's fiscal year 2019 budget request of $970.7 million. This represents an increase of about $60 million compared to the fiscal year 18 annualized continuing resolution level. Much of this increase is being driven by the $47.7 million for activities related to the disposal of spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste, licensing activities related to the proposed Yucca Mountain repository, which I am sure my colleague, Mr. Shimkus, was happy to see included in the request. I would also note the budget request represents a decrease of 149 FTEs compared to the fiscal year 18 annualized continuing resolution, with 123 of those FTEs coming from the Nuclear Reactor Safety Program. Over the past few years, commissioners have appeared before this committee and provided updates on Project AIM, the Commission's effort to right-size the agency in light of changes and trends occurring in the nuclear industry. Without a doubt, the Commission has been streamlined. The budget has been reduced by about 13% and staffed by over 500 FTEs since 2014. This has been a steady trend, and while I understand and appreciate the goals of making the Commission more efficient, continuing cuts at this pace is not a good way to, for such an important and technical agency to run. At some point, you're no longer capable of doing more with less. You just end up doing less, and safety is one place where doing less is non-negotiable. So I would caution against continuing to push reduction targets if we are approaching a point where critical Commission functions such as safety inspection hours begin to suffer. Because if the Commission is unable to maintain essential personnel or replenish its aging workforce or hire additional staff with expertise in new technologies, it could be the public that does suffer. And the industry will certainly suffer too with delays in licensing and review processes. The Commission must be staffed and resourced at levels appropriate for carrying out its critical oversight and safety missions. I also want to mention that we have spent quite a bit of time this past year discussing grid resilience, and Secretary Perry's notice of proposed rulemaking to FERC, which would have compensated power generators with 90 days of fuel on site and was rightly rejected, in my opinion. I know there are many members that believe the nuclear industry is at a competitive disadvantage and nuclear energy production should be fairly compensated for its positive attributes. We may disagree which of those attributes are most important, but in my view, the best way to ensure the existing nuclear fleet is on a level playing field is putting a national price on greenhouse gas pollution. I would encourage the industry supporters in Congress to consider having that conversation. Finally, I must mention that in just a few months, without Senate action, the Commission will lack a quorum. I hope we can all urge our Senate colleagues to take up the nominations before then. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about what is next for the Commission. And again, I thank you all for being here, and I yield back, Mr. Chair, the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, the chairman of the Energy Subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to everybody. So my district, as you all know, many of you know, hosts 3 nuclear power reactors, and I certainly represent a very highly skilled, hardworking nuclear workforce that I visit often. All the men and women at the Cook and Palisades sites, including engineers, electricians, professional security workforce, indeed help provide clean electricity for thousands, hundreds of thousands of Michigan households, and I appreciate their dedication, and I'm proud of their positive impact on our community. This Congress, the Energy Subcommittee, has been examining the various economic pressures in our wholesale power markets. It has become clear that our nation's fleet of commercial nuclear power plants is at a critical juncture due to the increased competition among generation resources. Complex electricity pricing rules, abundant natural gas supplies, and relatively stable energy demand have created unprecedented market challenges for nuclear power generation. And consequently, some power plants are ceasing operation prior to the end of their license service period. So as we consider the future of nuclear power generation, we should not forget the industry's invaluable benefits to our nation's national security interest. The technological infrastructure of our nuclear industry supports the nuclear security posture of our nuclear navy, nonproliferation programs, and nuclear leadership over the safe, secure operations of nuclear facilities around the globe. And as we heard at a subcommittee hearing just last month, that position should not be taken for granted. A weakening domestic nuclear industry threatens our international credibility and our leadership. The NRC plays a key role in shaping our nuclear future. The mission assures that our commercial industry operates safely. However, much of the NRC's regulatory framework was developed based on technologies and industry structures that was set up some 40 years ago. In some cases, NRC's authority and process extends even further back to President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program and enactment of the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. Just as this subcommittee is examining how the Department of Energy's activities can be aligned with a 21st century energy outlook, so should the NRC consider how it can most effectively operate in a forward-looking manner. Today's hearing offers the opportunity to hear how the NRC can adapt in changing industry dynamics and technologies in use. A more nimble energy agency can address these challenges and ensure its procedures do not become impediments to a robust industry and our national security interest. I note that next week will mark the 10th anniversary of the service of Chairman Zvinicki. She recently passed former NRC Chair Niels Diaz and now is the second longest serving commissioner in history, only trailing Commissioner McGaffigan's 14 years. I should also note that nearly 40 years ago, Commissioner Burns began his career at the NRC and rose through the ranks to become its general counsel prior to departing the Nuclear Energy Agency. He returned to the U.S. when he was nominated and confirmed as commissioner in 2014, so while you may not have the same tenure length, you certainly surpassed the chairman in overall service with this organization. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Burns, for your dedication during your 2 years as chair. Among other improvements in the regulatory process, the NRC implemented its Project AIM initiative by prioritizing and rebaselining its activities. This allows reduced organizational costs, which ultimately saves tons of money for Michigan ratepayers. Thank you again. Also, welcome back Commissioner Jeff Barron back to the committee. He was a counsel here, as mentioned earlier, and confirmed by the commission. Clean and safe and reliable nuclear energy has got to remain part of our nation's electricity portfolio. I look forward to exploring the policies, and without objection, yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Sounds like purgatory, but having said that, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pullen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and our subcommittee ranker for holding this Nuclear Regulatory Commission oversight hearing on the President's budget proposal. And I welcome Chairman Zvinicki and Commissioner Burns. Zvinicki. Oh, and I got to watch it with you, huh? Zvinicki? All right. And Commissioner Burns. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome back to the committee a distinguished former member of the Democratic staff, Commissioner Jeff Barron. Last year, I opposed Secretary Perry's notice of proposed rulemaking to FERC that would have undermined functioning electricity markets by tipping them in favor of nuclear and coal. And despite that opposition, I continue to believe that a safe, efficient, and modern nuclear fleet should be an important part of our nation's effort to combat climate change. However, nuclear power and technology still have challenges to overcome. For existing units, it's critical that they be able to meet the safety needs of a post-Fukushima world, the security challenges of a post-9/11 world, and the financial requirements of a market with some of the lowest natural gas and renewable prices in history. These price pressures are contributing to the early closure of units across the country, such as the accelerated shutdown of the Oyster Creek facility in New Jersey. And while Oyster Creek is very old and was due to close soon anyway, there are also newer plants capable of many more years of production that are threatened for closure because of these economic pressures. And as a result, many states are taking action or formally considering action to preserve the operation of their nuclear plants. The fate of these plants is up to the companies who own them, the governors and the legislature of those states and others, and the courts. And those are the proper venues and players to make these decisions, not FERC. Meanwhile, advancements in nuclear technology, particularly in the area of small modular reactors, hold the possibility of a newer, safer generation of nuclear power, and I support the work that companies like New Jersey's Holtec are doing in this area. The test for the industry is to show that such units can be brought online in a timely and cost-effective manner, a question that continues to remain unanswered. We also still need to address the storage and disposal of nuclear waste and the rapidly accelerating phenomena of decommissioned units. The legislation authored by Chairman Shimkus that was overwhelmingly reported out of this committee last year is an important step towards dealing with that issue, and I hope to see it on the House floor in the near future. I believe there is an important role for nuclear energy to play in addressing global climate change, but I want to make perfectly clear that safety must come first. This is a critical moment in time for the nuclear industry and its regulators, and I commend the Commission for its ongoing efforts to adopt the size and structure of the NRC to today's regulatory realities. However, it's critical we ensure that the Commission has the staff and resources it needs, not just to carry out its mission, but to carry out it well. The job of the Commission is to regulate nuclear power for the benefit of all Americans, not just one industry or sector, so we must work together to find a way forward for nuclear energy without sacrificing safeguards. So again, I want to thank the Commissioners for coming. I look forward to the testimony, and I yield the balance of my time to Ms. Matsui.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Pallone. I'd also like to welcome the Commissioners for being here today. I'd like to echo the Ranking Member's support for efforts to license an interim storage facility for spent nuclear fuel. As this committee is aware, it's absolutely critical that we allow communities to redevelop shut-down reactor sites by moving forward with a process to consolidate spent fuel. The current storage reality is wasteful of taxpayer resources and detrimental to communities. We've all seen the efforts to build a permanent repository repeatedly stall, but right now we have a path forward to license a consolidated storage facility, meaning there is an opportunity to move the nation's spent fuel to one location. I'm pleased that the NRC has docketed 2 applications for interim facilities and that the Commission is requesting the funding necessary to evaluate both concurrently. I look forward to hearing more from our Commissioners about the NRC's work on the spent fuel storage licensing process. Thank you, and I yield back.
Lady and gentlemen yield back their time. The answer is yes. We now conclude with members' opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. We want to thank all our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. Today's witnesses will have the opportunity to give opening statements, followed by a round of questions from members. Our witness panel for today's hearing will include the Honorable Christine Savinicky, Chairman of the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Honorable Jeff Barron, Commissioner, U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the Honorable Stephen Burns, Commissioner with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We appreciate you all being here today. We will begin the panel with the Honorable Christine Savinicky, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Welcome to you all. We're glad to have you here.
Good morning, Chairman Upton and Shimkus, Ranking Members Pallone and Tonko, and distinguished members of the subcommittees. My I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the U.S. NRC's fiscal year 2019 budget request and related matters. The funding we are requesting for FY 2019 provides the resources necessary to accomplish our mission, which is to license and regulate the civilian use of radioactive materials, to ensure adequate protection of public health and safety, and to promote the common defense and security. The NRC's fiscal year 2019 budget request, including resources for our Office of the Inspector General, is $970.7 million, represents an overall increase of $59.8 million compared with the fiscal year 2018 continuing resolution. This requested increase in resources is largely tied to the proposed activities related to the license application Mountain Deep Geologic Repository for spent nuclear fuel and other high-level radioactive waste. Additional funding is also requested for further development of the regulatory infrastructure needed to review advanced reactor technologies and for additional work on accident-tolerant fuel. The NRC proposes to recover $815.4 million of the requested budget from fees assessed to NRC's licensees. This would result in a net appropriation of $155.3 million, with $47.7 million to be derived from the Nuclear Waste Fund. The 2019 request for our budget line, the Nuclear Reactor Safety Program, reflects an overall funding increase of $25.8 million, but a decrease of 125 full-time equivalent employees when compared to the 2018 annualized CR budget. The 2019 budget request for the agency's other principal budget line, Nuclear Materials and Waste Safety Programs, is $183.7 million, and that reflects an increase of $46.8 million. Again, this is principally attributed to the resources requested for the high-level waste program, as previously mentioned. In summary, the NRC's budget request reflects to achieve additional efficiencies while carrying out our core safety and security mission, but also preparing for future work responding to current realities. On behalf of the Commission, I thank you for this opportunity to appear before you and for your continuing support of our important public health and safety mission. We will be pleased to answer your questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I recognize the Honorable Commissioner Barron for 5 minutes. I'm sorry, we're fighting over spelling back here, so.
Chairman Upton, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. It's great to be back with my colleagues to discuss NRC's fiscal year 2019 budget request and the work of the Commission. Chairman Svinicki provided an overview of NRC's budget request. I want to briefly highlight a few related efforts underway at NRC. I'll start with Project AIM, our multi-year effort to take a hard look at what work the agency is doing and how we're doing that work. The goals have been to become more efficient and agile and to prepare for the future. The results of Project AIM and our very limited external hiring have been dramatic. In just 2 years, NRC's workforce has declined by more than 12%. The agency started the current fiscal year with around 3,200 employees. That's about the same staffing level as in 2006, before NRC started to ramp up for the anticipated wave of new reactor applications. When Project AIM got underway in 2015, the NRC staff envisioned that it would take until 2020 to match the agency's resources to its workload. But NRC was able to make progress much more quickly on getting to the right staffing level for our current and expected workload. Going forward, we need to internalize an enduring focus on efficiency. For the agency's long-term health, we also need a stable pipeline of new talent through external hiring and an emphasis on maintaining the NRC staff's core technical capabilities and safety inspection activities. As Chairman Svinicki noted, the NRC staff has launched a transformation initiative to identify any steps the agency should take to improve its approach to reviewing new and novel technologies, such as advanced reactors, accident-tolerant fuel, and digital instrumentation and controls. I think that's a good focus for the transformation team and appreciate that the team is doing a lot of outreach to stakeholders. I look forward to hearing their thoughts and recommendations. There are many other important efforts underway at NRC, including the implementation of post-Fukushima safety enhancements, the power reactor decommissioning rulemaking, the review of the first small modular reactor design application, and oversight of construction at the Vogtle site. We're happy to discuss these and any other issues of interest. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Commissioner Burns for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus. I also appreciate being here, Chairman Upton, Ranking Members Pallone and Tonko, and distinguished members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to testify you before today. I also appreciate Chairman Upton's kind words. I can tell you 40 years ago at this point in time, I had a big weight off my shoulders because I knew in my last semester of law school I had a job coming up in August, so that was the thing. I didn't actually expect I would stay in this field for 40 years, but it's been an interesting one. I've always enjoyed not only the legal issues, but working with technical staff and others, both in our country and internationally. I support the chairman's testimony this morning and agree that the funding we're requesting provides the resources needed to accomplish our safety and security mission while continuing to improve our efficiency and effectiveness as an agency. As a number of you have noted, the NRC has undertaken some significant efforts over the last few years to improve that efficiency and effectiveness. Project AIM was a major part of those efforts, but additional improvements have included implementation of improvements to the NRC's rulemaking processes, to its budget formulation, to its fee calculations and billing, and also to agency staffing and workforce planning. Although the vast majority of the specific tasks under Project AIM were completed, and its spirit still endures, and we're still working to continue to be an effective agency. It's important not to lose sight, however, of the fundamental safety and security mission of the agency. We can always strive to perform better in that mission and to better risk-inform our decisions, but that safety and security of the public must always be the central focus. Having spent 37 years of my professional career with the NRC, I know there are times that when we have had to learn from our experience, learn to do better, and to improve our performance as a regular. But on the whole, I can say that I think we hit the mark the vast majority of the time in achieving a high standard of performance. And if anything, over those nearly 40 years, I've come to the conclusion it's never good to say, we've always done that way, let's do it more that way. There's always ways, and I can think of times across my career where we've had to reset, think about how we're doing things, think about how we can do them better. And I think that's what we're doing under the chairman's leadership. Over the past year, we've continued to hold the industry accountable through regulation and oversight, ensure the effective implementation of the lessons learned from the Fukushima Daiichi accident. We focused on cybersecurity, worked effectively with our partners in the states to ensure the safety of our radioactive materials program, and sought improved performance by fuel cycle facilities. At the same time, we've undertaken reviews of the first small modular reactors submitted for design certification. We're implementing strategies to be better prepared for the review of advanced reactor or Generation 4 designs. Credit belongs largely on a day-to-day basis to the work of our dedicated staff in achieving these accomplishments, and I appreciate their day-to-day focus on ensuring adequate protection of the public. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
We thank you. I'll now begin with questions, and I'll start with recognize myself for 5 minutes. So the first one will be go to Chairman Savinicki and Commissioner Burns. First, let me thank you for your vote last summer to take the next steps to determine what is necessary for the resumption of the Yucca Mountain licensing process. A few weeks ago, NRC staff held a public hearing to discuss what steps are needed to reconstitute the Licensing Support Network, or LSN. The LSN is a database of licensing documents associated with the Yucca Mountain license application. The NRC requested $30 million in fiscal year 2018 to continue its statutorily required review of the license application and $47.7 million for 2019. Will you please describe what commission-level decisions and guidance will be necessary when Congress appropriates funding to resume the NRC's adjudication of the license? Chairman?
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus. In broad terms, if funding is provided, we need to begin to rapidly put in place the infrastructure to resume the adjudication that was suspended some years ago. As you've mentioned, in preparation for that and under the court's remand to expend previously appropriated nuclear waste fund money, which we have at this point, I think, based on the monthly report we sent to you yesterday, a little bit under $500,000 left. We have looked at alternatives to reconstituting the document library that would support the evidentiary process in the licensing hearing. And also, we are undertaking a high-level real estate survey of facilities that might be available in Nevada to support conducting the hearings in a local, near to the facility, which is our policy.
Commissioner Burns?
I would agree with what the chairman said. I think the point she makes is essentially where we are at this is that at the point where the adjudicatory proceeding was suspended several years ago, and that's the point to be where we would begin again, because the staff has done the safety evaluation reviews and the environmental reviews that they need to do up to date.
And let me go both to the same questionnaires. What are we doing to preserve the workforce expertise that may be necessary to adjudicate the license? Chairman?
That work, that adjudication having been suspended so many years ago, candidly, the staff were, upon completion of the safety evaluation report and environmental work, reassigned to other duties, which was a way to keep them within the agency's span so that should funding be provided. However, over the course of time, we have had some significant retirements by my observation of people that had long history on and knowledge of the project. The good news is that with the safety evaluation report being concluded, I have asked if an expert was assigned and was fresh to the project, if they had the relevant scientific expertise, could they just acquaint themselves with the record, with the conclusions of their predecessors? And I'm told that some experts view that they could possibly become conversant in as little as 6 months.
Great. Commissioner Burns?
I would align myself with the chairman's.
That's fine, thank you. Let me ask this question. Chairman, can you just state, because we have new members of the subcommittee, new members of Energy and Commerce, so what was the basic conclusion from the safety and evaluation report which you issued a couple years ago?
The NRC's expert staff documented their conclusion that there were no safety or environmental impediments to the issuance of a license. However, they did note, and this is a construction permit license because this is two-step licensing, they did note, however, that the applicant, the Department of Energy, lacks the water rights and they don't have clear ownership or title to the land, which is a requirement of our regulations. But those were the two impediments to issuing the license, and they were not safety or environmental.
And those are some of the things we tried to address in our legislation, just for some of my colleagues. There was also a, correct me if I'm wrong, there was also a statement that if constructed and the facility, long-term geological repository, was in place, based upon current information and current knowledge, that storage would be safe for 1 million years. Wasn't that a conclusion of the safety and evaluation report?
That was the conclusion of the expert staff.
Does anyone disagree with that, the rest of the panel? Thank you. With that, I think I'll just yield back my time and recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to our witnesses for being here. The mission of the agency is very critical, so it is important that we understand your resource requirements. Some members may believe that the Commission has too heavy of a hand, that burdensome regulations on the industry are hurting its competitiveness. So to our Chair, Svinicki, can you give us a sense of the types of major new rules the Commission has approved in recent years?
Well, to take recent fairly broadly, post 9/11, there was a suite of new security requirements that were imposed. And after Fukushima, although the regulations were not significantly modified, new measures were required for what we call severe, low probability hazards, very severe earthquakes and floods and other things. There were additional protections that were mandated at nuclear power plants. Also, in response to the cybersecurity threat against the United States in recent years, the NRC has instituted new cybersecurity regulations. So those are the major areas that come to mind in the last 10 years.
And as it relates to licensees, have there been many major rules for new requirements on those licensees?
The areas I described did involve new rules. Major, minor, I would say that the post 9/11, that was a major impact in new requirements. Fukushima, I would not describe as being a major impact. And the cybersecurity regulations are sincerely new regulations.
Mm-hmm. And Commissioner Barron, what's your sense? Is the Commission imposing many new and burdensome requirements on industry?
Well, I can give you a shorter term perspective. Commissioner Burns and I have been on the commission now about 3.5 years. In that time, I can think of only 3 final rules that went into effect that involve any kind of new regulatory requirements. Only one of those 3 rules relates to power reactors. That was a rule that involved a requirement for a licensee of a power reactor to let us know, notify us in the event of a cyber event. That was not a, it was a low-cost rule and one that I think is pretty clearly needed. The other 2 didn't involve reactors at all. One had to do with medical uses. It was something that, by and large, the medical community was very interested in having done. And then the final one affected only a handful of materials licensees in the Caribbean and had to do with meeting treaty requirements. So since late 2014, 3 rules, that's it. I would actually argue there are a couple of rules we should finalize that we haven't yet. One relates to post-Fukushima safety enhancements. It's the rule on mitigating strategies that's been before the commission for a while. That's a rule that's really the culmination of years of work to enhance safety after Fukushima. And there's another rule that would assist in better preparing the agency for accident-tolerant fuel applications by having technology-neutral, performance-based standards in place, as opposed to the standards we have now, which are actually technology-specific. We have particular technologies that are established in the regulations. If you want to do something new and innovative, you're looking at an exemption to do that. So it's been very limited over the last 3.5 years, and I think there are actually a couple we should do.
Thank you. And it seems to me that Project AIM has achieved its goals. I fully understand the need for the Commission to right-size, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm concerned about the consequences of continuing staffing reductions at this rate moving forward. Can anyone explain the potential impacts of further significant FTE reductions?
I would just respond, Mr. Tonko, that right now, the budget we've submitted for FY19, we're confident does not have or cause a diminishment of our ability to carry out our safety mission. When, in my time on the commission, we were once at a peak of slightly over 4,000 employees. Onboard strength, the number reported to me yesterday, was just a few over 3,000. So we have come down quite a bit since the days of the nuclear renaissance. And I think the one thing that we are looking at is high fidelity in terms of our workforce planning. This is something we pay a lot of attention to make sure that as we have attrition, we are not losing the core competencies that we need. We're also very focused on training and development of staff so that they can fulfill future needs as staff retire.
Right. I appreciate that. That still seems like a huge cut. I heard earlier as Chair Shimkus talked about that expertise for Yucca Mountain, but I know the Commission has an aging workforce, and similar to hiring the next generation of NRC staff, we're seeing new technologies, including advanced reactors being developed and an increasing need for cybersecurity. So within those disciplines, we have, a concern also. I'm guessing these changes require new expertise among the Commission staff. If hiring freezes continue and the next generation of Commission staff cannot be recruited, what is the potential loss of institutional knowledge?
We do not have, although we have strict hiring controls in place, we do not have a hiring freeze in place. What we do is we look very closely at the core competencies of retiring staff and work to make sure we either have redundancy or are training people for the future. So we do monitor that closely.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our panel today. I was upstairs and we've got an opioids investigative hearing going on, so I kind of have to bounce back and forth, as do some of my colleagues. There's enormous potential with the development of small-scale modular reactors, including from my home state of Oregon, NuScale. And I know NRC staff has met a significant milestone earlier this year when they determined that SMR design would not be required to meet certain off-site power requirements, which avoided unnecessary and unneeded regulatory planning. So, Chairman Savinicki, will you please provide an update on the status of NRC's review of the SMR design application? And to your knowledge, is NRC staff on track to meet its targeted 42-month review window, including meeting the various milestones within the overall review period?
Thank you, Chairman Walden. As you note, the NuScale design was docketed for review, and although we're in early days and early months of that review, the staff is proceeding on schedule with what we call interim milestones of the review. I've also had an opportunity to engage the applicant NuScale. They've provided positive feedback that the NRC staff is proactive on the other item you mentioned, which is the resolution of the unique and novel elements of this design and resolving anything that arises in terms of aligning our regulatory framework and regulations with the new and enhanced features of this design. So my observation is that the review is proceeding according to schedule so far.
And are there outstanding policy issues that must be addressed to successfully complete this licensing process that you're aware of?
Yes, but so there are policy issues being resolved regarding both NuScale and small modular reactors broadly, but those have high visibility within the agency. I would assess that the NRC staff has scoped the universe of those issues, and there are policy resolution plans for each of them.
All right. And what is the NRC's forecasted total cost to complete the NuScale design review? And are you aware if NRC is currently performing with respect to the forecasted budget?
My previous answer had to do more with the schedule. I would need to take that question for the record. I'm not sure of what our estimates are as far as cost or man-hours expended.
Recently, the NRC staff implemented a new procedure to manage what are known as requests for additional information, or RAIs. Are you aware if NRC staff applied this new RAI process to NuScale's SMR application? And if so, can you speak to the number of RAIs relative to any comparable licensing action?
The new discipline around request for additional information has been applied to the NuScale review and has been applied broadly throughout the agency. A brief description would be that prior to requesting additional information from an applicant, the NRC expert must identify the safety or environmental conclusion that is supported by that data, and what that does is it ties the request to the agency's underlying findings that we need to make. NRC managers report that that discipline has really improved the efficiency and effectiveness of the request for additional information process, and it is in place for NuScale, although I don't have a specific report on how it's affected the numbers of requests.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I just add, I had a meeting last week with NuScale, and this issue came up, and what they reported to me was that they had kind of going into this process an estimate of how many of these requests for additional information they would likely have, and that the numbers have been lower than what they anticipated.
Oh,
so
right.
I
Very
think
good.
It's going well in that regard.
Very good. I had the opportunity to go to Idaho Falls with Chairman Mike Simpson and tour the INL lab there too, and I know some of this may get built out there eventually, but the lab's doing amazing work in the space of nuclear fuel and their other missions. I was very, very impressed. Chairman, one other question. It's more rhetorical than anything else, but not hard to answer. You've served on the commission with a full complement of 5 commissioners, as well as 4 and now 3. While the current setup allows the NRC to fulfill its mission, would you agree that a full slate of 5 commissioners, as established in law, allows for a more robust organization and diverse viewpoints in decision-making?
Yes, and may I add my full-throated support for my optimism and hope that the Senate will act on the 3 qualified nominees, including my colleague for reappointment. I hope that that happens before June 30th.
That would be a hint from this body to the other that we'd like to see these commissions all fully I'll call it staffed, but fully filled with very competent people. And we've dealt with this out of this committee with other commissions that are still waiting for nominees. Upstairs, in fact, at DEA, it's an acting administrator. We don't even have anybody nominated to be the administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration. And so it's something that I think we share, that robust, full-fledged commissions are good things. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership on these nuclear issues and other energy environment issues, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the chairman and ranking member for holding today's hearing on the NRC budget. The NRC does important work, and it's essential we have a body adequately funded for their mission. While the budget is the focus of today's hearing, there's a few other policies I'd like to focus on as well. It's been 33 years since Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and we still haven't a permanent or interim storage facility, cheating ratepayers out of billions of dollars and collecting fees and leaving utilities holding the bag for thousands of gallons of nuclear waste. This Congress needs to pass and act legislation authorizing the creation of more than one interim storage facilities while we work with states and agencies toward opening a permanent geological repository. My questions, Chairman Savinsky and Commissioners, thank you for being here today. Approximately 90% of your budget comes from annual fees assessed to the NRC licenses. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
As some of the older nuclear sites continue to shut down, do you expect strain on the Commission's budget for the loss of revenues from these fees?
Yes, as the mathematics work, as the number of operating reactors declines, the fixed costs of the regulatory program are spread amongst fewer licensees. Therefore, it does have an effect of increasing the burden on each remaining operating reactor. At some point, mathematically, that reaches a point that would be very difficult to support.
I know the chair and the commissioners are in a different issue, but are concerned. Do you think you do support opening of an interim storage facility?
Our commission, because we are the safety and security regulator, would be policy neutral on whether or not the nation should move forward with an interim storage facility. We would be the independent arbiters of the safety of that facility through issuance of a license.
Okay. With the Yucca Mountain permanent storage issue being what it is, what would be the benefit of opening an interim storage?
Well, again, not as a policy view of our commission, but as a practical matter, it would take sites that have permanently shut down and other locations that are storing a lot of spent nuclear fuel, and it would move it into one safe and secure location. But that's not a policy view of our commission. It's simply an observation.
Do you believe the private industry could be capable of safely and responsibly operating an interim storage facility under supervision?
Well, we will reach that determination if either of the two contemplated storage locations should move forward with the licensing. Again, the Holtec site in New Mexico is under our review right now, and the Waste Control Specialist location in Texas has been suspended at the applicant's request. However, there is some signal that that may move forward under new ownership.
Currently, those two applications you mentioned for consolidated interim storage facilities have been submitted. I have to admit, both of those storage facilities geographically are fairly close to each other. I think maybe even share the same strata in West Texas and southern New Mexico. NRC, one is in Andrews County and one is in Lee County in New Mexico. Where are these applications currently at process? I know you said the one in Texas temporarily suspended, although there's been a huge amount of investment, I think, in both of them.
Yes, the Holtec facility in New Mexico has been submitted. We have docketed that application, which means that we've assessed that it is complete for purposes of review. So we've begun the review of that application. We were at the stage of reviewing the WCS Texas location. However, the applicant asked us to suspend. There is an acquisition of that company now ongoing. The new owners have indicated that they will be giving us some communication in the near future about the potential resumption of that. We don't know if that would be asking us to resume what we had in-house or if they're going to modify or somehow have a revised approach.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have no other questions, but I know you and I and a number of people share the frustration that decisions were made in the 80s that have been put off now until a new century, and hopefully this Congress can actually move that ball down the road, so to speak, or either that change the field. But Congress needs to do something, and thank you for holding this hearing.
Chairman, thanks, the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Chairman Upton from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would start off by saying in Friday's New York Times on the front page, there's a story that's headlined, U.S. says hacks left Russia able to shut utilities. The first sentence of that story reads, the Trump administration accused Russia on Thursday of engineering a series of cyber attacks that targeted American and European nuclear power plants and water and electric systems and could have sabotaged or shut power plants off at will. So my question is, what can you tell us in a non-classified answer that relates to this story? Specifically, can you tell us if they were penetrated in a safety significant consequence? I would note that the story continues to say that Russian hackers had not leapt from the company's business networks into the nuclear plant controls. Is that still accurate? Can you give us that assurance? And what role does the NRC have in playing with these, in hearing about these situations? What technical expertise concerning power reactors is relevant that you might be able to share with us this morning?
Thank you, Chairman Upton. And respecting the open setting, I would state that the NRC's role is that we are fully integrated with the FBI, the Justice Department, and the other agencies that made the announcement last week. These were matters known to us prior to them being publicly released on Friday. Our role is not the security of the electricity grid as a whole. We leave that to our colleagues at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. In terms of the penetrations, of course, as the committee is well aware through its work on cybersecurity, the cyber attacks against the United States are persistent and serious, and the U.S. government interagency, including the U.S. NRC, are involved in constant monitoring of the sophistication of these attacks, of the success, but even the attempts. There's a lot of monitoring of the unsuccessful attempts. It is true that corporate networks at U.S. nuclear utilities were probed, as was described in the announcements. However, safety systems at operating nuclear power plants were not penetrated. This is principally due to the fact that these systems are isolated from the corporate systems, and that provides a measure of, if you will, air gapping of that, and you'd have to leap over that, which is technologically, at least to date, not possible to do.
Thank you. The NRC sends the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee a monthly status on NRC's licensing activities, staffing, and related information. Would you be able to send that report to us as well?
I see no reason why we would not provide that. I'm surprised that we're not, but yes.
And in January, NRC Executive Director of Operations initiated a transformation effort with a focus on identifying transformative changes to NRC's regulatory framework, culture, and infrastructure. And as you know, Chairman Walden Shimkus and I wrote recently to express our interest in this initiative, and we appreciated your timely response to the letter, which was received yesterday. This NRC effort appears centered on new and novel technologies, including the areas of digital instrumentation and controls, accident-tolerant fuel, advanced reactors, big data, et cetera. Yet the benefits of these new technologies require a change in how NRC executes its mission and ultimately regulates the nuclear industry. I understand that the NRC staff will be providing recommendations and strategies for implementation to the Commission in May.
Yes, although I am aware that they've received in excess of, I think, 500 or 600 proposed transformation initiatives. So if the staff were to need additional time to synthesize and prepare a set of recommendations for the Commission, just for myself, I would be supportive of that. I think they've been kind of deluged with good ideas.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member, full committee, Congressman Pallone from New Jersey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are of Mr. Barron. In her written testimony, the chairman notes that while the fiscal year 2019 budget request represents a proposed increase in funding for the commission overall, most of that increase would go towards activities related to the Yucca Mountain project and reviewing advanced nuclear technologies. While I'm not looking to quarrel with the increased focus on these particular programs per se, I am concerned about what those choices mean for other activities that I believe must be priorities for the Commission. So, Commissioner Barron, I understand that NRC recovers the majority of its budget through fees, and I have some questions about the proposed fees and what it means for staffing at the NRC. First, I'm concerned by the sharp drop in full-time employees at the Commission and what this means for safety. Do you believe that the Commission has the amount of employees it needs to do its job well, not just adequately?
I think most of the cost-cutting measures we've implemented to date over the last few years make sense, but I would echo Mr. Tonko's point that I don't think any further steep reductions would be sustainable. Going forward, I would like to see our funding and FTE levels stabilize. I think we need to be careful that we're not so focused on cutting costs that we do erode the technical capabilities of the agency or our inspection activities.
All right. And the second question is the current 90% fee structure putting undue pressure on the Commission's budget because of the shrinking number of nuclear plants and the economic pressure the industry is facing due to competition?
Well, as Chairman Svinicki noted earlier, in theory, if you have fewer operating plants, that increases the amount each remaining operating plant would have to cover.
And she actually said that at some point it would be unsustainable.
Yeah, we haven't gotten to that point yet, and in large part because of Project AIM, we have seen our costs come down over the last few years. So fees have not gone up over the last few years for power plants. They've gone down actually, but at an extreme, if there were a large number of plants that shut down, you could have an effect there where it would be a challenge.
But you're saying, as she did, that's something that could happen, but you don't see it happening in the immediate future.
It has not happened to date, and I don't see it as something that we're worried about right now.
All right. Thanks so much. I yield back, Mr.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the Chairman Emeritus, Joe Barton from Texas.
Well, thank you. More importantly, I'm the current Vice Chairman, such as that is.
I stand corrected.
Well, I'll take both. I think they're both complementary. My question is a basic question. I'm looking at the briefing book, and it says that we get $804 million in fees. What portion of that is supposedly going into the high-level waste fund to help dispose of high-level nuclear waste?
None of that amount. Again, the Yucca Mountain-related activities are all funded from the appropriations from the Nuclear Waste Fund, and we have to execute and keep that money in budgetary purposes. It is executed and outlaid separately from the fee collection.
So the $804 million are operating fees from the existing reactors, is that correct?
Yes, those are invoiced directly from the NRC to the utilities, and then we receive the payments from them.
And the fee that the utilities pay to help dispose of high-level waste, if we were to ever license one, that's a separate fund and a separate amount of money in addition to these other fees.
Yes, it was separately enacted in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. The Department of Energy established 1 mil, which is 1/1000th of a cent, I think, per kilowatt hour charge that ratepayers paid in their utility bills. And I think that was then provided, it was collected by utilities, provided to the U.S. Treasury.
How much of that, Madam Chairwoman, has been collected over the history of its collection? Do you know?
Many tens of billions, but I would have to respond with a precise figure. Of course, the fee is in suspension now because the U.S. utilities went to court and said in the absence of progress on the disposal site, they asked for relief, and the collection of that fee has been suspended for some years now.
So it's accrued as a contingent liability, but it's not actually been collected from the utilities. Is that right?
I'm not sure of the court's treatment of that in their decision. I know that they offered the relief of the suspension of the collection of the fee. I don't know if the liability continues to accrue, and upon a resumption of activity on Yucca Mountain, if that would be then reimposed on the utilities. I'm not sure.
Now, you're aware that we've passed a bill, it's languishing, I believe, in the Senate, that would change the law, and it would allow for licensing of a high-level waste permanent repository, but also it would allow temporary storage to also go forward.
If the gentleman would spend, it's languishing in leadership, not the Senate.
Oh, I thought we had passed it in the House.
Not on the floor.
Oh, well, I stand corrected. I can't blame that on the Senate then.
You can blame it on leadership.
I will. But Subcommittee Chairman Shimkus has been laboring, very heroically to get some money appropriated so we could actually begin the review and hopefully the license of a permanent waste repository. I believe that's about $130 million, John, is that right?
I'm sorry.
How much are we asking for to actually let high-level waste be reviewed? 150 million, 130 million?
Well, in the fiscal year 18, it was 100. It was 120 to DOE and 30 to NRC, and then in the fiscal year 19, it's 47.7 million for the NRC and another 120 for DOE, I believe.
It's fun to ask questions of the subcommittee chairman while you guys are out there. Shows what a good subcommittee we have. In any event, my question to you, Madam Chairwoman, does the NRC support Chairman Shimkus in his effort to actually get some real money appropriated so we can proceed with the review of a high-level waste permanent repository?
The NRC has requested funding in our budget for fiscal years 18 and 19 to resume these activities.
So that's a yes.
But we, as an independent safety regulator, we have not taken a policy position on the pending legislation.
Well, I take that as a yes. All right, I'm going to yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking members of the committee for holding this hearing today. As many on this committee know, I'm a strong supporter of nuclear energy. I'm greatly concerned by the dramatic increase in plant retirements or announced retirements in the last few years. Prior to 3 plants retiring in 2013, no reactors had retired since 1998. We then faced another round of retirements and are now staring down 8 more announced retirements starting in October 2018 and through the summer of 2025. These retirements represent a loss of reliable and affordable electricity and family-supporting jobs. And it's not like the demand for thousands and thousands of megawatts these plants provide disappears. As the Energy Information Administration explains, the vast majority of this lost generation has been replaced with either coal or natural gas, and it seems very likely that that trend will continue into the future. As I said at our nuclear infrastructure hearing in February, it's imperative that we maintain or even bolster our nuclear fleet here to adequately address climate change, and I hope our committee pursues greater action on the issue in the future. Madam Chairman, let me ask you, and I want to follow up on one of the responses that you provided on an important question from Representative Green regarding the NRC's fee structure. There are bipartisan legislative proposals in both the House and Senate that provide a backstop for fees that NRC could collect from each plant. I would think that with increased appropriations, if necessary, this would provide greater certainty to your agency as well. Otherwise, I fear the NRC may face a situation where the dramatic drop in plants from which you can collect fees jeopardizes your agency's ability to generate a sufficient operating budget without being overly draconian. I think many could see this as becoming a downward spiral. Chairman, let me ask you, do you think our committee should pursue or consider changing the NRC's fee structure to make it more sustainable, both for the NRC and the individual plants?
Our commission hasn't established a position on this, but speaking as a 10-year member of the commission and answering for myself, I would note that the potential wave of retirements is noticeable and appreciable, and although I don't know at what point the number of operating reactors has diminished so far that the 90% fee recovery is not sustainable, I think that the predicted number of potential shutdowns does make this a timely issue for the Commission and the Congress to engage in a dialogue on this matter. Again, the 90% recovery is a provision of law, so if it is something that looks like it is having an unintended consequence or an unsupportable effect, it would be, in my view, appropriate for the Commission and your committee to examine the question.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you some efficiency questions, too. Your testimony highlighted the NRC's recent announcement establishing of a transformation team that would, in your words, seek to identify potential transformative changes to the NRC's regulatory framework, culture, and infrastructure. Do you have a timeline as to when we could expect those proposals, and what type of changes can we anticipate?
Transformation is meant to encompass not just a small, easily implementable change, which we're terming more an innovation than a transformation. The team that's been chartered to look at the proposals, I believe, has in excess of 500 or 600 proposals now pending. Those have come from both inside the agency, but they've also engaged broadly on transformative and innovative organizations. So the Commission is scheduled to receive a set of recommendations in May, but I think that the amount of proposals that have been generated may make the staff want to have a little more time to evaluate those, and then we would take the proposals that they and recommendations they make to us out of that process and consider those after we receive them in May. But again, I'm trying maybe to signal a little bit of opening for relief with the staff. I think it would be difficult for them to look at 500 or 600 ideas in the amount of time that they have.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm going to yield back my time.
Would the gentleman yield his last 26 seconds?
Yeah, sure.
Let me, when the payments are made to utilities based upon the non-performance of the government, where does that money come from? Do we know?
And this is perilous because this is my memory of the court's decision. I thought they suspended the collection from the ratepayers so that the utilities are not receiving any revenues because their request of the court was to be allowed to suspend the recovery of it from consumers.
Anyone else can answer that?
But you're talking about the litigation.
Right.
That comes from the judgment fund.
And the judgment fund?
Is taxpayer funds.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, with that, I thank my colleague. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and welcome to our three witnesses. This first question is for you, Chairman Samicki, and you, Commissioner Burns. Last August, the NRC issued a press release announcing it was going to conduct a review of, quote, past administrative regulations, unquote, to find any that are outdated or duplicative. That was supposed to start in the fall of 2017. However, I haven't heard anything about that since then. So my question is, will either of you talk about, first, why reviewing these regulations is important for an industry that is struggling, and number two, is there an update on time we can expect this report and move forward? Chairman, you first, ma'am.
I'll begin, thank you. I think that the voting has moved along on that proposal, and I believe that mine may be the lagging vote to complete the Commission's deliberation on the matter. It is still under review by the Commission in terms of the Federal Register notice and other underlying things that would kick off that review. So it is still contemplated, and I suspect it would move forward in the coming months.
Commissioner Burns, you want to add something to that, sir?
What I would add, one of the things that, this was an issue that came to my attention when I was a chairman, and how it came up is drop-in visits from utilities, interactions I had at conferences and things like that, and it's the question of there may well be, in terms of some of the administrative reporting requirements, going to the structure of them, for example, that might be more efficient. And I think that's what we're intending to look at. The example would be, and I can't pull, unfortunately, out of my head right now, maybe a good example, but the idea was we're asking particular reporting requirements in an age like when I began at the agency, we didn't work through the internet. We worked through fax machines was the technology of the, of the day. So some of those types of things, how you can report what you need to report. It's not that reporting's bad or doesn't need to be done, but can you do it more efficiently? Through electronic communication. Are there duplications and things like that? That's the type of thing I think I'd like to get at.
Thank you. The final question is for all three of you. And there have been some situations where disagreements between headquarters and the NRC region have resulted in NRC being unable to make timely decisions to provide necessary certainty to licensees. In one case, a licensee chose to shut down the reactor because headquarters in the regions were at an impasse. What's the process for resolving these disagreements between headquarters and the regions to ensure that timely decisions are made and the licensees are provided regulatory certainty?
The NRC is obligated to provide clarity and give timely decisions. We are also obligated to implement a cohesive and coherent program across the United States so that a regulatory outcome in one region would be the same outcome in another region. Like any large organization, this requires very effective and continuous communications between the agency's very senior executives, the Commission, and a faithful execution of our regulatory framework across the country. Are we perfect? No, although I don't recognize the specific incident you allude to. This is something that both our Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office occasionally audit for us. And we do look at the consistency of the findings and regulatory outcomes across the country, but there are a lot of inspectors and a lot of individuals in the loop. Again, the basic process is escalation through management, through executives in the agency, and then coming to one unified decision.
Ms. Brown, very quickly, I have 48 seconds left to add something to the chairwoman's comments.
No, I think she covered very well.
I agree.
Okay, and one final point of observation. Chairwoman, congratulations. Your Michigan beat my University of Houston Cougars in the NCAA finals, going to the Final Four, but you'll play another Texas team, and pretty quickly you'll hear from Mr. Flores about his Aggies, so.
Thank you. I wondered if I might hear something while Chairman Upton was in the room, but.
Oh, I hope the gentleman's yielding back his time.
I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Chair, and I recognize this gentlelady from California. I'd like to personally thank for all her work on this issue for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I outlined earlier, I'm extremely supportive of efforts to transfer our country's civilian spent nuclear fuel to a consolidated storage facility. Communities across the country, including those near the former Rancho Seco nuclear generating station in Sacramento County, have been waiting decades for a spent fuel storage solution. And I have to also thank Chairman Shimkus' willingness to work together on these spent fuel issues. We were able to make real progress as this Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act moved through this committee, and I continue to support our compromise that was included in the bill. Chairwoman Savinicki, is that right? Can you please tell us more about the Consolidated Interim Storage Facility licensing process generally? What do you look for in an application, and how is it evaluated?
Thank you for that question, Representative Matsui. As you noted in your earlier remarks, the agency, the NRC, has one current and one suspended review in front of us for the development of consolidated interim storage facilities. There is a facility contemplated in New Mexico, and the contractor is Holtec. We have docketed that application for review, and the review is ongoing. In general, it's our estimate that it would take approximately 3 years to conduct this type of review. We have some experience in the 1990s. There was a similar proposal of private fuel storage in Utah. However, we issued the license as an agency, but the facility was never developed. But again, to return to the two active contemplated facilities, the first is the Holtec facility in New Mexico. The other is in Texas, and it is Waste Control Specialists. That review was suspended at request of Waste Control Specialists. Their company is undergoing a merger or acquisition. I'm not certain, maybe an acquisition. The new owner, although that process is ongoing, has indicated that they will be making a communication to the NRC regarding that suspended review. We don't know exactly what form that would take. They, of course, have the option of modifying or withdrawing that and submitting something different. So if they were to just ask us to reactivate the review that is suspended, that is something that could be more readily done. If they want to modify or significantly alter the proposal, then we would just have to wait to see what our estimate of the time to review it would be.
Okay, if you take the first step there, what are your next steps in the licensing process if you restart this?
The general process involves both a comprehensive safety review, and a separate team of environmental experts will conduct a review of any environmental impacts of the facility or the proposed action. Those proceed in parallel tracks, and so there is some synergy and expertise between those two teams. And we develop a safety evaluation report and then an environmental review. And those are the basic products that come out of our review. We are looking for no negative impacts on public health and safety, and in accordance with storage and transportation regulations that we have that are very well established.
Well, can you outline some of the differences between the facilities envisioned by the two applications?
I think in general they are very similar, much more similar than they are different, and there may be some differences in the way that they've structured how they intend to operate or the fuel that they would take, but I would need to respond with those details for the record.
Okay, certainly. And as I said earlier, I'm pleased to see that you requested adequate funding to be able to consider both the WCS and Holtec license requests in fiscal year 2019. It's critical that we move forward with both licensing processes at the same time in order to maximize our chances of really reaching a viable interim storage solution that reduces the burden on taxpayers. What constraints on licensing are you facing at your current funding level?
You're correct that we have requested funding in fiscal year 19 for 2 reviews. I would also note that although we do not have an enacted level for fiscal year 18 yet, we do have funding in there for 2 as well. Even though the one is suspended, we provided a budget of flexibility so that if it were resumed, we would be able to begin that in the current fiscal year. So we're not aware that we have any shortfalls in those requested amounts.
Okay, fine, and thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back to her time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our commissioners for being with us today. The NRC's fiscal year 2019 budget request includes about $10 million to develop the regulatory framework for advanced nuclear technologies. While the NRC is required to recover about 90% of its budget from fees charged to licensees, the Commission is allowed to request certain funding to be appropriated by Congress outside of the fee base. I would note the Advanced Nuclear Technology Development Act, which I sponsored and was unanimously passed by the House in January of this year, provides for this funding to be exempt from the fee recovery base. Similar to that provision in my legislation, the NRC's budget request for this funding in previous years provided for a direct congressional appropriation. Would any of you like to address why the source of this funding from off the fee basis subject to fee recovery has changed from the previous years?
Thank you for that question, and I realize that Congress has indicated a willingness to provide direct appropriated funds instead of recovering this from the fee base. I would observe that in perhaps commensurate with the continued work that we're doing on advanced reactors, it is our projection that in fiscal year 19, we may have actual submittals of designs for review. And so some of the thinking about having it be in the fee base is that we do try to allocate and recover costs from a company if the costs are directly attributable to that company. So in fiscal year 19 is the earliest date at which we think we may have a company come in with an actual design submittal.
Okay, just to clarify, just to make sure then, so that you would support my legislation, which would amend the underlying statute to clarify the source of the funding to develop a regulatory framework for that advanced nuclear technology?
Our commission has no policy view, but as a member of the commission, not as chairman, I would indicate that the funding that is provided off fee base has been, I think, advantageous because developers will come in and engage the NRC if they know that they're not going to receive an invoice every time they want to come in and learn more about the regulatory framework or perhaps float a concept of a design attribute that they're worried that we would never license. And so Congress's support of money off the fee base, I think, is generating a regulatory efficiency because the technology developers are more likely to come in and get early regulatory engagement. And I think it's also helping us that when we get a design, we'll know a lot more about it.
Okay, thank you. The use of the digital instrumentation and control, or digital I&C technology, is of growing importance for the current nuclear fleet and the next generation of reactors. This technology can enhance safety, reliability, and efficiency while replacing obsolete analog components. Many licensees are not pursuing modifications that implement digital technology due to uncertain regulatory approaches and associated challenges. For new plants, the uncertainty creates risk the promise of advanced digital INC systems will not be accomplished. To address these issues, Industries has formed a digital INC working group to engage industry experts with the NRC staff to resolve high-priority technical issues, improve the regulatory infrastructure, and facilitate efficient implementation of DI&C projects. Madam Chairman, in reality, as a number of our nuclear reactor facilities have passed 40 years of operations, much of the technology still being used in these facilities can be dated back to World War II. Do you believe that updating these systems and components to digital technology is important to sustaining these facilities?
Yes, the obsolescence issues in the supply chain are very real, and it is not only important, I think it will be essential for the NRC to develop a working framework for the adoption of digital INC technologies.
Thank you. Commissioner Burns, do you believe there is an obligation to acknowledge the potential safety benefits of increased usage of digital controls, and how do you view these benefits can be represented in NRC's regulatory regime?
Yes, I would agree that the newer digital controls have benefits. I've seen that from when I've gone to power plants in terms of areas where they have been able to implement it. What we have to do, which is I think what the chairman was alluding to, is we need to keep on our staff in terms of working with the industry in terms of getting over some of the humps, if you will, that are sort of become some barriers toward better integration on some of these systems. I think we're seeing it in the new the new technologies. It's been a lot in terms of, as you noted, the retrofitting onto what were originally analog systems and getting more digital systems in there. But it's something I'm certainly in favor of us continue to work on.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman, and I thank the commissioners for your work. Last year, Secretary Perry issued a proposed rule that power plants that have long-term fuel storage have a financial advantage over those that don't. That was overturned by the FERC. But do you think that was a good idea, each one of you, given the financial crunch that nuclear plants are facing? Starting with the chairman.
Our commission was not involved in that, and we're not economic regulators like our colleagues at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Candidly, even as a personal matter, this is outside my realm of expertise.
Secretary.
This is pretty far outside NRC's mission area. We leave this to FERC.
Right.
Okay. Well, the next question was, do you think the traditional nuclear power plant is viable moving into the future? And this, in terms of economics, do you think they're going to be viable?
My understanding, again, and I don't have access to any proprietary business information. I read the same reporting as others do, but some of the units in the regions where they operate are operating at kind of breathtaking losses and are not economic. Others operate in other markets in the country and have other regulatory rate recovery mechanisms that they are profitable. So it appears to be a very geographic situation.
Okay, that's interesting. Do you think the new technology is going to be more economic than the older technology, like the small modular reactors?
It's difficult to say by their design attributes. They appear to preliminarily offer certain efficiencies, but I think the competitiveness of this technology in the market is dependent on natural gas prices and other things into the future that I'm not really even expert on.
All right, I'll change the subject. Local buy-in is critical, in my opinion, for nuclear waste repository, for a nuclear waste repository. How much chance is there for local buy-in in Yucca Mountain? Whoever wants to answer that.
Gentleman needs to define local.
Well, I'd say the state of Nevada. Is the state of Nevada going to tolerate moving forward with the Yucca Mountain storage facility?
Well, again, we are the independent licensing body that would make the ultimate determinations on issuance of a license. So the state of Nevada, many Nevada counties, and also California counties are parties to that licensing proceeding, and we are the quasi-judicial body over that. So I don't, I think it's perilous for us to opine on that.
Okay, well, in my opinion, again, complete transparency is absolutely necessary for long-term storage repository to be accepted. What is the NRC doing to make sure that there's transparency in these sorts of deliberations?
Well, I would note that the adjudicatory proceeding has, I think maybe 24 admitted parties, that those proceedings are all conducted publicly. There are over 300 specific challenges issued that will be adjudicated when if that is funded and that adjudication occurs. So again, that is a public licensing proceeding where all of these matters in contention or challenge would be litigated in a very public forum.
And I would just add, if the adjudication resumes, I think it's essential for NRC to hold the hearings in Nevada close to where many interested stakeholders are located. That's been NRC's longstanding policy, that if you have a contested adjudication, that it be held, as close as, to the vicinity of the proposed facility. And there's obviously a very high public interest in this proceeding if it were to resume. So my view is it's very important that those hearings be held in Nevada.
Are there any other sites around the country that are being considered? And if there are you reaching out in advance to get local interest and buy-in?
No, because the law requires us to consider the Yucca Mountain application. That was the consequence of the 1987 Amendments Act, which focuses on Yucca. So we're not authorized to go look at other sites at this point.
But wasn't the Nevada side also held up? I mean, if you're not allowed to do it by law elsewhere and you're not allowed to do it in Nevada, what choices are there?
No, the Waste Policy Amendments Act 1987 directed the NRC and I think also DOE to focus on the Yucca Mountain site. So that's why the efforts that have gone on that eventually led to an application in the mid-2000s focused on Yucca.
All right, Mr. Chairman.
They are correct. Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of you for being here. Thanks for being at our hearing. I think it's unbelievable that we're still talking about Yucca Mountain years and years later, and people's opposition to it is based on witch science, and concerns, and it's the law, and it's the right thing to do. And anyway, but my district is home to 4 nuclear power plants in Byron, Braidwood, Dresden, and LaSalle. It's the most of any district in the country, meaning that the work you all do is vital not only to the safety of these communities, but also to my constituents who work in these plants, pay their utility bills, and especially in Illinois, rely on nuclear power to power their homes and businesses no matter the weather. 50% of power is, in fact, nuclear in Illinois. H.R. 1320, which I sponsored with Representative Doyle, includes language to control corporate overhead costs and keep them in line with other federal agencies. I'm concerned about a lack of transparency and accountability in the corporate support budget proposal because these costs are passed along to ratepayers, including my constituents, through charges at the NRC licensees, charges to the NRC licensees. Specifically, the FY19 budget requests an increase of $1.5 million for corporate support, even though staff is decreasing by 108. The justification states the increase is a result of salary and benefit growth, increases for IT asset management, operations, maintenance, and security of core IT systems, and targeted investment in development and modernization efforts. However, there's no details or support in the budget. To the chairman, can you explain in more detail why there's an increase in corporate support costs?
Thank you, Representative Kinzinger. In general, you've described the areas that are causing the increase, and if we have not provided detail, perhaps we can work with your staff after the hearing to provide some fuller supplementing detail on this. I would note that the cost of living, the percentage increases that have been funded in general, agencies have been asked to find those within existing budgets. Also, as our workforce gets smaller, it tends to be older employees do stay with the agency, and they've received certain higher levels of seniority. Also, the benefits part of salary and benefits for every federal employee with increases in health care costs, there is some escalation in that figure year to year due to rising health care costs. Also, the NRC does have, as part of government-wide IT modernization, we have some unsupported platforms for various agency IT systems. I know we report to other committees of the House regarding our overall IT modernization and also the securing of those systems against cyber threats. And there are increasing costs throughout the government related to those matters. I think in general, those are the nature of the expenses that cause the increase in the FY19 budget.
I just think, the important point I want to make is obviously continue to take tangible steps to maintain discipline on that, as you know. It's Congress's responsibility to regularly review statutory authority and, when appropriate, to make updates reflecting our changing world. For example, the outlook for global nuclear power is fundamentally different from when Congress first allowed the use of peaceful atomic energy in 1954 or established the NRC in 1974. Congress hasn't completed a comprehensive reauthorization of the NRC in over 30 years. To the chairman, are there legacy provisions, including the foreign ownership control and domination restrictions, or the required advisory committee or reactor safeguards that warrant revisiting by Congress?
As a general matter, it is useful to revisit statute, although I would note that I continue to be impressed with the wisdom that is enshrined in the Atomic Energy Act. I think for a statute as old as it is, there was a lot of foresight on having, technology flexibility and things like that. But there is the many intervening decades of experience in the United States nuclear power program in general. The technology is understood at a vastly deeper level now, and there are also many, many operating reactor years and decades worth of experience. So I think that relooking at what the smart individuals in the 1950s thought is probably a worthwhile endeavor.
Thank you. I think it's important to note, I think the United States is losing or has lost its edge in nuclear power, and we've given it to other countries, and that's a big problem and something that I think we need to address wholeheartedly. And lastly, to Commissioner Burns, are there other areas Congress should examine given the state of nuclear energy today in your mind?
Going back to your question on the Atomic Energy Act, I appreciate in your bill you noted a couple areas where I thought were worth looking at in terms of foreign ownership and the mandatory hearing. I agree with Chairman Siminicki. One of I think the beauties of the Atomic Energy Act is the flexibility it allows the Commission to adapt over time. So there's some of these that are legacy provisions. The mandatory hearing provision, for example, just go out because I was doing some research earlier this year on it, was really actually a punishment of the Atomic Energy Commission for a lack of transparency. It actually imposed it both at the construction permit and operating license level, and it was because the AEC wasn't transparent about its licensing. I think we've come a long way since 1957 and then 1962 on that.
Thank you, and I yield back, Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I thank the commissioners. My concern that I want to address is decommissioning. In Vermont, Vermont Yankee, located in southern Vermont, right on the Massachusetts and New Hampshire border, was one of the first, I think the first merchant plant to be decommissioned. So we're sort of at the tip of the spear addressing the combination of issues between the industry that has to shut that down and the local and state communities that want to have a say in the process. And over the course of the last couple of years, Senator Sanders and Senator Leahy and I, on behalf of Vermonters, have been raising some questions that we want included in rulemaking. One, the lack of state and local stakeholder involvement in the decommissioning process is a concern. Two, the questionable uses of the decommissioning trust fund, such as for spent fuel management, is a recurring issue at the Vernon plant. Three, the reality that the use of safe store decommissioning procedure will effectively delay the cleanup and the redevelopment of the nuclear site for decades is a big issue for us. We'd like to put that place back into operation. sooner rather than later. And then 4, the reduction of emergency planning functions during periods when spent fuel remains are in spent fuel pools. That's an ongoing concern. That's an issue for us in Vermont, but as more and more plants are going offline, that's going to be an issue for them as well. And the questions that I wanted to start asking about were on the rulemaking process. And in the initial phases of this, it appeared that the NRC, in fact, was paying attention to many of those concerns that I just cited. But there's been a tug of war in the process, and the industry concerns appear to me, and I think to Senator Leahy and Senator Sanders, to be paramount. They want flexibility on some of the safety issues, but they really are resistant to the 4 issues that I mentioned. So that's of real concern to us, and not just to us, because this, as I mentioned, is going to be relevant for all these other plants that are going to get decommissioned. So I'll start, Madam Chair, with you, if you would. Do you believe that state and local stakeholder concerns should be considered on equal footing with those of the industry, and believe that a final decommissioning rule that codifies regulatory and safety exemptions that industry has requested, but don't address concerns over the use of the decommissioning trust fund, the local input in the post-shutdown rules, would be problematic? We'd like both included.
Congressman, thank you for this question, and you and the people you represent have been very, very active in the rulemaking process. The stage we are at right now is that the NRC staff has developed a regulatory basis, and they will begin the process of developing a proposed rule to come before our commission. My approach as a member of the commission is to look at the totality of the public comment record, and I don't look at who sent the comment. I look at the underlying matter that the comment is raising, and I look to make sure that the agency is responsive to that comment. So I don't want to prejudge where I would be on a proposed rule that hasn't come before me yet, but as part of my review, I will certainly look at that comment
I understand
record.
you can't prejudge it, but we really want some assurance that the local concerns will have a seat at the table. That's really the bottom line of what we want. And there's a tug of war because the industry concerns are sometimes different. They want to get out sooner rather than later. And the local community wants that property back in service and obviously concerned about the decommissioning fund. Mr. Barron, can you tell me what opportunities state and local stakeholders will have over the coming year to weigh in on the decommissioning rulemaking?
Sure. Well, the main opportunity, there have been 2 periods of public comment to date, and as the chairman mentioned, we got a couple hundred comments. I looked at them all, and you're right. States and local governments are very engaged on this issue. They want to be heard. The next big opportunity will be when the proposed rule is prepared. The commission will vote on a proposed rule, and that'll go out for public comment. Right. And that'll be the first time that stakeholders have an opportunity to look at what is it that the agency is proposing to do and what is their reaction to that.
All right, and thank you. And Mr. Burns, thanks for your work over the years. This basic request that our communities have to be at the table as a full and equal partner?
I'd agree with what my colleagues have said. I think as the proposed rulemaking comes before us, one of the things I'm going to look at is some of those process issues, as well as the substantive issues about what does safety demand, and assuring that we have clarity on things like the decommissioning trust fund. Trust funds. It's interesting. We had a good meeting, I think about a year or 2 ago. We had one of the representatives from the Citizens Advisory Committee from Vermont was there, and heard her there. Some of these things, I think, will be regulatory solutions. Some of them are going to be the interactions within the states themselves. But I do think it's important that the voices are all heard.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the commissioners for being with us today. The last time that you were here before this committee, 2 years ago, I expressed concern then about the regulatory creep associated with what is known as application of the backfit rule. This authority is one of the most powerful regulatory tools at NRC's disposal, which is why it is critically important, in my view, that the commission is vigilant about the staff's use of the backfit rule. So in regards to the committee to review generic requirements, since your last appearance here, NRC was in the process of providing new guidance to what is known as the CRGR, the Committee to Review Generic Requirements. This committee, composed of senior NRC staff, is intended to review these backfit requirements, which are regulatory requirements imposed on all nuclear power reactors. So, Commissioner Burns, under your leadership as chairman, CRGR was directed to update its charter and revise its review procedures. Has CRGR issued its revised charter, and if so, what are the principal updates to the document?
Yeah, I believe that they have. I'm not familiar with all the details of it, but clearly at the time, one of the things that I was looking for, and I had the support of my commission colleagues at the time, was to reinfuse some vigor in the CRGR process, also to provide some more consistency across the agency, particularly in the staff, because on a day-to-day basis, that's where things are going to happen, about consistency in the backfitting process.
And you are
we can probably provide for the record, you know, the specific things that would help your
please do
answer you.
You are still the leader, I mean the chairman of the CRGR, right?
No, I am not the. I've actually never been the chair. The head of the CRGR is a staff, a senior staff executive.
How often do they meet?
Yeah. I don't know how often. Ed Hackett, who is Deputy Director for Research, is the current chair of the CRGR.
How do they report to you guys on what their status is as the commissioners?
They report to the Executive Director for Operations, but they also provide routine reporting on the number of their activities. They may meet as needed to review a proposed regulatory measure, but again, we can provide greater clarity for the record.
Okay, thank you. Chairman Zvinicki, what are the next steps for CRGR to enhance its role to review and approve or disapprove of staff's proposed backfits?
Since the commission last appeared before you, Congressman, and engaged on this issue, the agency's return to greater adherence and fidelity on backfit moved far beyond the CRGR. Although we have undertaken the measures that you described, it became apparent in the reviews ordered by the Executive Director for Operations that comprehensive retraining was needed of agency staff. That has been conducted, and again, we're not changing the backfit rule. We realized that with the amount of staff growth and staff turnover we had, that we needed regular training on adherence to the backfit rule, and there will even be, I believe, a wave of follow-on training that is going to occur. So there certainly has been a higher spotlight on adherence to backfit since we last appeared before you.
Okay, all right. Recent guidance from Office of General Counsel, which has been endorsed by the Commission, states that when the NRC staff identifies backfitting, it should first consider whether one of the adequate protection exemptions apply to the backfit in question. So, Chairman Zvinicki and Commissioner Burns, given the maturity of the NRC's regulatory framework, would you agree that situations requiring imposition of backfit should be relatively rare and would typically require significant new information indicating that a safety issue is not adequately addressed by the Commission's current regulations?
As a member of the Commission, I'm in agreement with that statement. That would be, I think, a reasonable description of the maturity of adequate protection determinations that have been previously made. However, there can always be new knowledge, as you note, and so I would say as a member of the Commission, anytime the staff is contemplating an adequate protection exemption to the backfit rule, that gets my attention very closely for the reasons you state.
Okay, all right. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Cardenas, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to have this discourse, commissioners. My question is to whichever commissioner wants to answer the question regarding the potential elimination of 149 full-time equivalent employee positions. If that were to take place by the design of the commission, if that's a
would there be more or less scientists involved going forward than are today overall? Are we talking about positions that are in the science arena, are the technical folk? Are we talking about tertiary positions? Where would the crux of those 449 or so positions
There
come
is,
from?
let me begin by stating there is no contemplated involuntary separation or reduction of employees that we contemplate now. The figures may have to do with, if they arise from the fiscal 19 budget, we have areas of work that are completing this year, and so it really isn't individual employees that are on board right now. The figures vary up and down depending on the licensing work that we project to have before us in the 19 budget. So it is not that we've identified positions for elimination.
Okay, so we're talking about positions that are basically having to do with the work structure in the past and present and going forward, and a better structure for the department.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Aside from that, how is the department doing when it comes to recruiting today's technical folks that the department needs to fill the positions that would be ongoing? How is that environment today?
Well, I will say that you identify, I think, one of the greatest challenges for federal agencies, and that is making certain that we are preparing ourselves for the future by bringing in the promising new entrant, recent college graduates. Again, under a declining workload for our agency, we are not as active out with colleges and universities and recruitment. We do that only on a very, very targeted basis as we have attrition of people from positions. So we are, over time, becoming an organization that has more senior people at higher pay grades, and we do pay attention to making sure that we are at least bringing some newer employees into the pipeline. But again, our work in general has been declining, and the opportunity to do that has been less.
I would just add, you know, in a 2-year period, the number of employees we had at the agency dropped by around 12%, which is a really dramatic decline for just a couple years. That was largely the result of attrition. So we have a certain number of people who are retiring each year, moving on, and pairing that with very, very limited external hiring during those years. Going forward, for the health of the agency, we're going to have some external hiring. We're going to need to bring new talent to the agency. That's true for any organization. It's fine to have a period of a couple years where we just through attrition shrink pretty significantly, but for our long-term health, we're going to have to make sure we bring in new talent so that we have the capabilities we need 5, 10, 15, 20 years into the future.
Yeah, there's no question that there's probably not an industry in America that isn't affected by the baby boomer retirement bubble that we're going through right now. But at the same time, when I was in college, I was an engineering student. By the time I got my degree, I had done some internships with various great organizations that actually went out there and recruited students like myself. Are you able to focus on that kind of recruitment, or unfortunately is it kind of like a hodgepodge of trying to pull together a little bit of resources to do so, or is it a concerted effort to recruit some of that great talent out there, that new talent?
I will note that we do continue to have a summer intern program. We get engineers and scientists, and I believe maybe even have some legal interns or law clerks opportunities to prepare for the future. Again, it is commensurate with the projections that we will continue to have a declining workload. But I think, as Commissioner Barron notes, we continue to recognize the importance of having younger employees come into the pipeline.
Okay. Well, to the benefit of all of us who represent literally different parts of the country with different makeups. Mr. Chairman, if we could get a report from the Commission on the program and how local communities can enlist and making sure that young people, young talented folks can actually apply to these kinds of programs, or, for example, the campuses that you are already involved in, or the campuses that you'd like to be involved in. If there's some kind of blueprint or something that, again, every single member here represents a different part of America, and I'm sure that we would like to make sure that the young talent from our communities certainly have an opportunity to enlist their talent with your organization.
I think we can certainly provide more specifics for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Thank the panel for joining us today, and to follow up on Mr. Olson's initial comments regarding the men's and women's Sweet 16s. I'm proud to report my district has more teams than the others, with 4. Anyway, let's get down to business. New technologies provide great promise to increase safety and performance for nuclear reactors while also affording increased efficiency and improving economic competitiveness. One of the critical path resources to get from here to there, though, is the NRC's qualification of advanced fuels. And I'm concerned that our advanced nuclear community will be stifled at the outset if there's not clarity and predictability with respect to timelines for innovators and investors to have certainty that the NRC will allow new fuel composition and design. So Chairman Svinicki, what is the NRC doing to consider fundamental issues associated with qualifying advanced fuels?
Well, thank you for the question, and this is a growing area of work for the industry and for our agency as a result. To begin with, in order to qualify a new fuel type, developers have to be able to have access to performance data, meaning if you've got new materials, new alloys, and new configurations, you need to be able to put what are called lead test assemblies in nuclear power reactors so that you can then harvest those as kind of samples and you can take performance data. We do have a number of utilities right now that either have inserted lead test assemblies for new fuel types or are in the process of developing, documenting the safety of doing so. So that exploration of these lead test assemblies and development of the underlying data for new fuels is currently underway.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Burns, given your long experience with NRC and your having had a front row seat for seeing technological advances, would you please describe your expectations with respect to having a predictable path for advanced fuel development?
Well, I would echo much of what the chairman said. I think the part of it for us, too, is assuring that the regulatory process is in a state that allows that to go forward. I give a recent example, I think, the staff with respect to the ability of utilities to start testing advanced or accident-tolerant fuels in terms of just the process of getting some lead test assemblies in there is clarified its guidance, and that's gelled. And those are the types of things, in addition to the technology aspect, which is extraordinarily important, of course, that will help the process along.
So you've talked about the real-world testing and existing reactors. What sort of advanced modeling and simulation and computational tools do you have to predict the behavior of these advanced fuels?
I would have to defer the staff and maybe for the thing unless the chairman wants to add.
The NRC does not have as many tools as the U.S. Department of Energy, so as a result, our experts in these areas have begun discussion with the Department of Energy regarding what tools they have and to what extent they could be made available for us to use in making safety determinations going forward. Now, as an independent safety regulator, we will want to have some measure of independent or confirmatory analysis that we will do, but it may be that the tools can be utilized by us to do that confirmatory work. I would say that those discussions are somewhat at the beginning stage.
Okay, thank you. My district includes College Station, which is the home of Texas A&M University. The Aggies have an outstanding nuclear engineering program, and it partners with both the NRC and the Department of Energy to help train the next generation of nuclear engineers through congressionally funded education programs, principally through the Integrated University Program, or IUP. Unfortunately, once again, the NRC budget zeroes out this critical program. If that's the budget that ultimately comes to fruition, and I don't think it will be, but if it does, where do we train the workforce of the future without the IUP? So, Chairman Svinicki?
I will respond by stating that the Commission's failure to include that in the budget is so that our budget will adhere to administration policies regarding programs such as this. Having said that, I will state that we have derived great value from when Congress has provided funding. We have executed that program, I think, with a lot of energy behind it and made good use of the funding that Congress has provided previously. So it is not any indication on the value of it by this commission.
Okay, that's helpful. My expectation is that Congress will continue to fund that program because, as you stated, we've had good results in terms of an advanced nuclear workforce. I yield back the balance of my time. Mr. Duncan, you're recognized for, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Mr. Hudson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman and thank the witnesses for being here today. Thank you for the good work you do. I represent Fort Bragg, the largest military installation in the world. Understand the importance of making sure that our troops have the necessary resources they need for the battlefield. A 2016 report from the Department of Defense's Defense Science Board concluded that, quote, there is an opportunity for exploration of the use of nuclear energy applications at forward and remote operating bases and expeditionary forces, end quote. These applications would result in first-of-a-kind deployment opportunities similar to how the Navy's deployment of nuclear reactors helped drive the construction and commercialization of existing fleet of nuclear power plants. However, for these advanced technologies to be successfully deployed, the NRC's regulatory regime and approved processes must be predictable and disciplined. One example of how the NRC manages what are known as requests for additional information, or RAIs. NRC staff uses RAIs frequently during its regulatory review, and GAO has noted the process can be time-consuming and costly. GAO reported the NRC staff and licensees identified two weaknesses in the RAI process. First, a gap between NRC's expectations and licensees' understanding of license application content. And second, staff departure from RAI guidance, which may result in redundant or unrelated questions and lead to additional time and resources required for licensees to address RAIs. Following GAO's review, NRC has been updating its guidance, including increased management review, and as with the Office of Nuclear Regulatory Regulation, efforts to conduct on-site audits or a public meeting to reduce the number of RAIs. Chairwoman, I'd like to ask you a few questions with respect to RAIs. How is the NRC ensuring that staff are following the guidance? For example, is NRC tracking data on RAIs? And if so, has the new guidance reduced the number of RAIs?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. There has been a focus on the discipline of the RAI process. In addition to the measure you noted, which is perhaps meeting with an applicant and getting greater clarity so that we could just completely reduce the need for certain questions to be asked, we also have instituted what are called job aids, and they are kind of checklists that are used by reviewers. And when it comes to RAIs, that job aid mandates that they have to identify the regulatory determination that is supported by the request for additional information, meaning if you're going to ask this question, what of the necessary findings does it feed into? And in some ways, there is enhanced management review, but a job aid such as that basically forces someone to take that into consideration. So it builds the discipline into the process. And the staff has thought of these measures, which again, I think are really helpful to both the analysts that are adhering to the new discipline on RAIs, and they kind of keep the system in check. So it's those, but there is, as you said, enhanced management review as well.
Makes a lot of sense. Can you provide updated RAI tracking information to the committee?
I know we have been working to begin to collect that, and I'm not sure how many months of data we have now. Could I provide to the record either data or a status update on getting those tracking systems in place?
That'd be much appreciated. Do managers in the offices of the Nuclear Regulatory Reactor Regulation and new reactors review additional rounds of RAIs, as GAO reported was the agency's intent?
I believe that that is still occurring. I don't know to what extent, as we get the job aids and other measures in place, it may be that there isn't as much need for the direct review because, again, the checklists and process are basically forcing the new accountability and discipline. But we can provide that for the record. In early stages, there was management review of all subsequent rounds.
I appreciate that, and I would be very interested in knowing what you found during these reviews in both offices. So thank you very much for that, and Mr. Chairman. Unless any of the other witnesses would like to chime in, great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Duncan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panelists for being here as long as you have. One thing about being junior on this, you get to go last. All the groovy questions have been asked already. So we're going to reach into our tool chest here. First off, I want to encourage my friends over in the United States Senate to confirm a great South Carolinian to the NRC, and that's David Wright, and would be a great addition to the NRC. I want to lend my voice to Mr. Shimkus and others have talked about Yucca Mountain and the need for a long-term stable storage facility for nuclear waste. We have 40 years worth of nuclear waste sitting at the Oconee Nuclear Station on the beautiful shores of Lake Kiowee. And that's just one nuclear reactor or nuclear power plant in the country that has nuclear waste stored on site, either in dry cask or wet cask storage. And we could throw in Savannah River Site, Hanford, Idaho Flats, Oak Ridge, and all these things where we have waste coming out of the environmental management efforts there. They need to go somewhere too. Vitrify it, put it somewhere for long-term stable storage. I want to talk about VC Sumner a little bit. We had one half of all the new reactors under construction in the United States happen to be happening in South Carolina at VC Sumner. And 7-8 years into the project, the rug gets pulled out from under and the construction stops. And you know, I wonder how we as a nation will be able to go forward with nuclear power generation and new nuclear reactor construction after VC Sumner. How are you going to incentivize investors to put that kind of money up, and the tens of years that take and the tens of billions of dollars in investment just for the permitting and licensing before you even get into the construction? How are you going to encourage investors to go that length knowing that 7-8 years into the investment, the rug could get pulled out from under them, they lose that investment? Now, they couldn't foresee the bankruptcy of Westinghouse, and you know, there were a lot of unforeseen things that kind of led into it, I guess. But I'm concerned about the future of nuclear energy. And I assume since you're all in the NRC, y'all support nuclear power production. Would that be a safe assumption? So yes or no question, do you support nuclear power generation?
Maintain objectivity in our independent safety and security licensing determinations, but I would note, as a degreed nuclear engineer, I didn't choose to go into the field because I thought poorly of the technology, but that's not as a member of the commission, where, again, I have to step back from a view on advancing the nuclear power program or not. We have to be policy neutral on that.
Right. So, Madam Chair, last year at VC Sumner, y'all had a number of NRC staff assigned to that project. Do you remember how many were assigned?
Well, the on-site presence was 5 inspectors who were at VC Summer full-time. They were supported by both in our Atlanta Region 2 office by supplemental inspections. Our theory or our approach to having Georgia and South Carolina, where the 2 projects were located, is that out of our Atlanta base, we could surge the deployment of the inspectors for the different expertise, so they kind of supported out of a common pool. I'm told, though, that the resourcing overall was of 40 full-time equivalent positions.
Right.
So that would be kind of people on a fractional basis out of Atlanta and headquarters and the 5 at the site.
Right. So you've asked for an increase in the budget, and the new Reactor's Office has significantly reduced workload, claims a 13% reduction in staffing, and yet you asked for an increase of $4 million in funding. How do you explain that contradiction?
Well, we could provide, I think, additional details for the record, but it would do with, as you note, there is a decline such as the termination of the summer project, but we do forecast that we will have increasing work on advanced reactors. We're very engaged with that community, and in FY19, we may have first submittals for designs to review of advanced reactor concepts.
Right. I guess for my constituents, they look at half the reactors that were under construction in this country, whether VC Sumner, and that project shut down. You had 40 people there, and they've got to be reassigned somewhere, maybe with NRC. I get that, but you're asking for an increase going forward. I understand what you're saying about looking at future technologies. That leads into my next question. I'm a strong advocate for small modular reactors. I've done a lot of research into molten salt reactors, and I hope those are the technologies that you're looking at, because there's energy poverty in the world. The U.S. could be a leader in this. Right now, we're getting our butts kicked by Russia in the construction of nuclear reactors around the globe. So I hope that new technologies do come online, and you guys expedite the approval process of that, and we can get more nuclear production online.
I will just mention on molten salt technology is recognizing that we don't have a lot of experts conversant with some of these different reactor types. We recently, we worked with Oak Ridge to develop a training course that we brought in-house at NRC. We sent 90 of our folks through that training on molten salt reactor technology, and I was pleased that the staff included not just scientists and engineers, but also lawyers and others that will have to have some kind of conversant knowledge of these new technologies. So we are working very much on the capability.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize, bouncing back and forth. We had another subcommittee meeting at the same time. Madam Chair, if you don't mind, instead of butchering your name, can I just call you Madam Chair? Is that okay?
That's fine, but I do have a mnemonic. I happen to be a vegetarian. I did live in Idaho, and my Idaho friends are okay with it. But if you think of the terms finicky, like a finicky eater, if you say swinicky, and so that's kind of that's the best mnemonic I can think of.
Swinicky?
Swinicky.
It's finicky. I'm from South Georgia. We talking Geechee, so I'm just sorry.
I don't think I'm making it any better.
I don't think so, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I want to talk about accident-tolerant nuclear reactor fuels. From what I understand, this is a game changer, and potentially it could be. And it's something that I guess came out of the accident in Japan, and through research, they've come up with this. You know, I represent Southeast Georgia, near Plant Vogtle, where we're currently building the 2 reactors, and I'm glad that they're following up on that, and they've decided to complete that project instead of abandoning it. But at the same time, Southern Company just recently announced that at Plant Hatch, another nuclear facility near there, that they are actually going to be loading the lead test assemblies for what is known as the accident-tolerant fuels, or ATF, if you will, and that this was a first for the industry. So my question is, what do you think about them? Is this a potential game changer, the ATFs?
Well, as you know, the loading of the lead test assemblies at Hatch is among the first in the nation. We have some other proposals that we know utilities will be inserting assemblies. And accident-tolerant fuel is a generic term. There are various fuel vendors that are developing potential new fuels that fall under that heading. And this is the first step, is to collect the performance data from the lead test assemblies at Plant Hatch and other locations. If the concepts prove out and the materials perform as predicted, which is, again, needs to be demonstrated, these fuels will have the ability to retain what we call source term and behave better in certain severe accident conditions. So you would have the potential for a diminished consequence off of the reactor site should a low probability accident occur.
So potentially it could be a game changer, potentially. So let me ask you, is the NRC changing any of their licensing approach to be ready for this, for the use of this, for these fuels?
Well, again, our regulations accommodate things such as lead test assemblies. Fuels have been developed and qualified in the past, so I think that we expect that that same framework can be utilized for the qualification of accident-tolerant fuels. It'll just be something that if new issues emerge or there are materials that have unexpected behavior, we'll have to work closely with the applicants to understand their plans for
resolving. So you believe you could use existing DOE codes? You wouldn't have to come up with new codes?
We are engaged with discussion in DOE to learn the codes and tools that they have and to see if those could be utilized for our confirmatory analysis.
Okay. Mr. Burns, Mr. Barron, thank you for having pronounceable names, but I wanted to ask you about Plant Vogtle. As you know, there's been a lot of problems down there, particularly in the permitting, and it's been such a drawn-out process that, you know, we've actually had Toshiba and Westinghouse, you know, went bankrupt, went out of business as a result of this, and I just want to know what the NRC can do to speed up the permitting process. I mean, obviously, we all want safety, but at the same time, not all of the blame goes on NRC for the permitting process, but some of what they were concerned about was the permitting process and all the hoops that they had to jump through in order to get things permitted.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. The interesting thing is I reflect back on the licensing process used, which was essentially adopted as a reform proposal in the late 1980s, the Part 52 process. The advantages were enhanced standardization, greater certainty. But the issue was in terms of some change, in terms of some design changes and things as you went on. I think that's a lesson learned from it. I think one of the things we're working through with Southern now is on the confirmatory items called ITAC. These are those last, in effect, the checklist when you're getting ready toward operation, and in terms of how they can be consolidated. So, if anything, I think there are lessons learned there. I think we're trying to take those to heart. One of the things I would say, too, is going back, is you look at, you had a design that wasn't fully certified. While the applicant was coming in with the application for the license, they had to wait for Westinghouse to get through it. That's a little bit different than I think the expectation how the process would work. But again, where I think we have some learning on some of these things in terms of change processes once the license is issued. And I think we're seeing some of that applied, particularly as we go into the advanced reactor technology.
Well, I hope, as you say, I hope there were lessons that were learned, because we don't want this happening again. We need nuclear energy. I'm a proponent. I'm on all of the above, and I believe that this is clean fuel that we need, and we just need to learn our lessons from what was obviously, some serious mistakes that were made along the way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Seeing that there are no further members wishing to ask questions of the first panel, I wish to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. Before we conclude, I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit the following documents for the record. There are none. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses submit their response within 10 business days following the receipt of the questions. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.